One word that perfectly describes what occurred in Week 10 when it comes to Big Ten football is predictable. You know, everyone's saying that Purdue could be a trap game, that Purdue has a great chance and likely will beat Michigan State. You all were right. And same thing to the people that said that Nebraska would play Ohio State close, that Minnesota might be overrated. You all were also right. Out of those three examples, one I picked correct was Nebraska, Ohio State. The other two, didn't believe in them. I thought that Michigan State being projected to lose would instead spur them on to victory. Because, from my experience, good state teams always prove doubters wrong. That was anything but the case against Purdue. And we'll get to that game later. But first of all, we're going to review my Big Ten power rankings. If you are new to this channel, give a like, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. And let's get into it. So first and foremost, I would say the top four teams would be your Big Ten championship contenders. You know, and maybe even put Purdue there. Though them having to play Ohio State, that's just another loss. That's why I kind of have the top four. Your top four here are the teams who, depending on who they match up against, I say that because, you know, Wisconsin against Ohio State for like the third time would kind of be painful, but whatever. Anyway, your top four teams are the teams that have the best chance to win the Big Ten. Ohio State obviously is the best team in the Big Ten. They actually handed Nebraska their worst loss of the season by points between the two teams, by margin of victory. Nebraska's previously worst loss by margin of defeat was, I think, 7 points to both Oklahoma and Minnesota. Ohio State's margin of victory was 9. And even with all their struggles, you know, Ohio State honestly looked like that they thought Nebraska would be a little weaker than Nebraska actually is. And they lost the turnover battle. They still won by nearly double digits. That is just what this Ohio State team is. We'll get to Nebraska later. On to Michigan. Michigan and Michigan State are kind of in the same boat. There's a coin flip between them. And you might be saying with Michigan and Michigan State, and the same thing with Penn State and Iowa, why is the team who, you know, beat the other team below the team they beat? Because, you know, Michigan State beat Michigan, Iowa beat Penn State. And just to get it out of the way, it's because I think Michigan and Penn State are better prepared, better suited for the playoff teams, for facing off against those teams than the Michigan States and Iowas are. Michigan State is a team that, unlike Michigan, is ultra efficient with what they're given. They're adaptable. They just play tough football. And it's kind of the same thing with Iowa. Iowa plays tough football, and they, for the most part, outside of the offensive line this year, they're efficient with what talent they have. Michigan, much like Penn State, are just filled with talent. They don't even need to be efficient with talent, and their talent will do some of the work for them. And they have good enough coaches and good enough staffs to where a lot of the weaknesses of these teams are hidden until you get to some of the bigger games. And even then, it depends. You know, Michigan State in their one big game, the D-line was exposed. For Penn State, it's been the run game all year. So, you know, Michigan is just this, you know, run-heavy team. They're stubborn. Penn State is kind of similar with the run. They keep running a lot despite it not working. So Michigan and Penn State, despite being stubborn, I think are better suited than the teams they lost to in Michigan State and Iowa, respectively, to face off against a team like Ohio State. It's just my opinion. Wisconsin is a weird team. Wisconsin here is this team that, you know, they might have one of the worst quarterbacks in the Big Ten. Actually, they do, at least by QB rating. And they're not like a modern team at all. But here's the thing. They found their O-line. Braylon Allen and Ches Malusi are, basically carbon copy of what Hassan Haskins and Blake Corum are. And they're behind now a good O-line. Mertz's receivers are emerging, Danny Davis III being one of them. And that defense is similarly with Georgia, one of the best in the country. Now, I don't know if it's anything close to Georgia's. It probably isn't. We wouldn't know unless those teams met, which Georgia would win big, by my guess. But Wisconsin here, like Iowa and Michigan State, does more with less, but they have a far better defense than either of the two, and they do have a more consistent ground game and offensive line play than either of the two do. Wisconsin's in this interesting position. The only reason they aren't ahead of Michigan State, and even Michigan, is because of the 3 losses. And Purdue is a similar story. Purdue's behind Wisconsin because they lost by a big margin. Plus, I think Purdue upsetting these teams, it is impressive. It is. But Iowa was overrated. Michigan State, I think, is a tad bit overrated. And Purdue does this and then goes out and loses. So I need to see more from Purdue before I put them ahead of Wisconsin here. But Purdue is this team where they aren't the best, at running the football, but you have David Bell and Aidan O'Connell, and you can pass for as many yards as you need to find a way to win. And when O'Connell doesn't make turnovers, this is definitely a top 25 team by all stretches of the imagination. So that's my top 7, Ohio State being the best, Michigan and Michigan State. There's a coin flip between the two of them. Michigan's more consistent. I think State honestly has the higher ceiling, at least on offense, but they need to improve that passing defense. Wisconsin, outside of quarterback, has one of the, if you took the QB position out of all these teams, Wisconsin would probably be number 2. Maybe could contend for number 1. Just shows you how important the QB position is. Purdue is a team on the rise. Penn State and Iowa are in this boat of how do we get our seasons back on track, but they're still better than the bottom 7. The bottom 7's what's up next, and we'll spend a lot less time talking about them because they're not really as relevant here. Minnesota is, I don't even know what to call them. They don't know who they are. It's pretty apparent. Losing to Illinois and Bowling Green and losing to Ohio State, yet beating Purdue and beating Nebraska. I don't know who you are or what you are. Also going on the road and dominating Colorado. I don't know who you are. And I don't know if Minnesota knows who they are. Now, PJ Fleck has little to work with. Minnesota's probably one of the most talentless teams in the Big Ten. He does not have a lot to work with. There's a lot of injuries going on. I don't know what's up with Tanner Morgan. But Minnesota is still on track to probably having 8 to 9 wins, including the bowl game. Maryland is on track to possibly, they face Michigan State, Michigan, and Rutgers, I believe, possibly go bowling. The issue with Maryland is they're below all the teams above them because despite having a winning record, Maryland's problem is they haven't had any impressive victories. Nebraska has had far more impressive performances. The difference is Nebraska is guaranteed to have a losing season, and they face Iowa and Wisconsin, so 3-9 is a huge possibility here. And that would be Scott Frost's worst record at Nebraska, which makes you think, why did they just extend him? We'll get to that later. But here's the point. Nebraska on their schedule, you have Iowa, Purdue, Wisconsin, Michigan State, Michigan, Ohio State, Minnesota. Those 7 teams right there. 7 of those teams were at some point ranked or are currently ranked. I don't excuse the Minnesota or Purdue loss. I just don't. I think all the other losses, except for possibly Iowa, are excusable. I thought that a 6-6 season in retrospect, a 6-6 season with this schedule would have been amazing progress. And 3-9, I think you're in the same or even better position because next year, and we'll get into this in a separate Nebraska video I'm making this week, you have a pretty good launching pad into the 2022 season. Illinois at 11 and Rutgers at 12, kind of a coin flip between them both, but Illinois actually has impressive road wins, and Northwestern and Indiana are like the bottom feeders, per se, of the Big Ten. Indiana has a guaranteed losing season. I think Nebraska would blow them out because, frankly, Indiana their defense is not the best against consistent and explosive passing offenses like Ohio State, and they can't really hold their own against anyone. Michigan State, that game was kind of an exception, and Indiana still lost that game. So that's my power rankings. Now we're going to talk about two specific games that I think have a huge impact, starting off with Michigan State and Purdue. This game here, I thought State was going to win because everyone was saying Purdue was going to win. And Michigan State teams, good Michigan State teams with a good mentality often go on the road and prove you wrong. But you know what this game was, in a certain sense? This was like a remake of 2010 Iowa versus Michigan State, except the score in the end was a lot closer. But the truth is, Purdue with a one-dimensional offense just smacked Michigan State, slapped him in the face over and over and over and over and over and over again until some teeth and then the jaw fell completely off. That's what Purdue did. And I think I said this post-Michigan game as well, that this bend but not break defense, it doesn't work. It worked against Michigan because, A, it's a rivalry, and you can run the most inept scheme and still win some rivalry games. Like, let's be real here. Rivalries are different. They just are. They'll like defy what would be laws in any way, shape, or form. Purdue, though, you have a better passing offense than Michigan does, and yet you don't even have a run game. And once Michigan State players start dropping like flies on the field, it's game over. And I'm not saying Michigan State's a bad football team. I think they're a top 10 team. I actually wanted to put them out of my top 10 because I'm looking at how they performed. I'm like, this is not a top 10 team at all. And then I looked at everyone else and I'm thinking, they're still better than Oklahoma State, in my opinion. They're better than a lot of teams. They're better than Baylor. They're still better than Wisconsin. I'm not going to move a 3-loss Wisconsin against over a 1-loss Michigan State team unless Wisconsin starts destroying, unless they destroy Minnesota or destroy Nebraska, like some competent football teams. But Michigan State allowing 594 yards, losing the turnover battle, and being dominated in time of possession. I mean, this game right here is what the Michigan game should have been, saying this as a Michigan fan. Michigan led in all of these stats outside of turnovers. We had more first downs, dominated time of possession. The difference is Purdue was able to stop Walker when they needed to. And this is the key to beating State. As long as you have a pulse, if you can stop Michigan State when you need to, on third down, on positions where they think they can run, you win the game. Congratulations, because I think Purdue's top 25, but it would be a total Purdue thing afterward to go out and lose one or two more games. And for Purdue, here's the thing. You don't exactly control your own destiny because, let's be real here, Wisconsin kind of leads the West with how they're coming back and how they beat you. But you can put yourself in a position to get somewhere. A nice bowl game, maybe your first 8-win season. I'm not going to say 9 because you traveled to Ohio State, but like an 8-win regular season, maybe win your bowl game and get to 9-4. I mean, Purdue's in a good position. They have a defense that tightens up when it needs to. And Aidan O'Connell, when he doesn't throw picks, when he's not a turnover machine, is a great quarterback. He is the 8th QB rating in the country. Peyton Thorne, even with the loss, he had a better game than he had against Michigan. Walker still had 136 rushing yards and a touchdown. And Jaden Reed came back and had 73 receiving yards and 4 receptions. So, listen, what this game just says is Michigan State has issues to work on if they want to have a chance against Ohio State, is all this is saying. This game basically confirmed the fact that Michigan State is not a playoff team. They're a good team. They're a great team. If they somehow beat Ohio State, then they're, whether I like it or not, then they're likely a playoff team unless they lay an egg against another opponent. But this game was interesting, and people predicted it to happen, and my thoughts are just, this is adversity, and we'll see how Michigan State responds against Maryland. Michigan had kind of this slow, grinded out win against Indiana. I would say the game was closer than the score indicated in a certain sense. That did not feel like a 22-point win, honestly, against Indiana. This coming from a Michigan fan. So we'll see what Michigan State is against Maryland, and we'll see what Purdue is truly made of against Ohio State. Because if they hang in with Ohio State, then this game wasn't an upset. This was just reality that was going to happen whether you liked it or not. But there is a good chance, not saying it's going to happen, I'll make my prediction video on Purdue and Ohio State later. Purdue could realistically get blown out by the Buckeyes here in Columbus. So this game was interesting again. And the second game I do want to talk about is Nebraska and the Buckeyes. So Frost reports released earlier yesterday morning that he's getting extended. I'm going to do a video on this later in the week, depending on what happens with school and such, perhaps early next week. But here's the thing. Frost showed us a picture, and I'm more interested in discussing this game than the Michigan State or Purdue game. We kind of all know what happened with the previous game. This game, I feel like people tuned in and are like, what? Martinez is making, Heisman decisions against Ohio State's defense. Granted, he threw a pick and had some inconsistent throws, but there were moments, like the passes to Samori Toure. Man, perfect, on point, allowed Toure to do what he needed to do to get to the end zone or get close to it. And listen, Nebraska is an offensive line away from being a playoff contender. And that sounds like heresy. It's not. If you only lose to Michigan State by 3, Michigan by 3, Ohio State by 9, Oklahoma by 7, right there, that's 22 points between 4 games. It's a little over, it's 5.5 points per game losing against currently top 10 teams. If you fix some stuff, you're immediately a playoff contender. That's how this works. You watch all of those games. Nebraska's only weakness is they cannot finish. There's too much offensive inconsistency. Their defense, nothing needs to change on the defense. What needs to happen is the offense needs to step up and be more consistent. And that's why Scott Frost had to fire. And, some of it was probably forced to keep his job, but I can imagine for the offensive line coach, he just, literally in his own mind without even the AD had to fire him. Because that O-line it's probably Martinez's worst O-line, at least by what I can tell by the amount of sacks Martinez has, had to deal with, and he's still improved. This is his best year thus far. He could also return next year. So I don't know what's up with Frost or Nebraska. I'm talking mainly about Nebraska here because I covered Ohio State in my Ohio State-Nebraska reaction video, mostly. But Ohio State here also has some questions facing it. They're not as critical, not as urgent as Nebraska's. But here's the thing. What was concerning about that win was that you beat Nebraska literally by outdoing them on special teams, which granted is how Michigan State beat them. Michigan beat them off a fumble, but you're Ohio State. You want to contend with Georgia and Alabama. And this team, I mean, we don't know how Nebraska would do against Georgia or Alabama. I mean, the joke is that Nebraska would lose to UConn by 7 and only lose to Nebraska by 3 or 7 points. That's just who Nebraska seems to be. But Ohio State, some sputtering red zone issues. I mean, literally just, and then Stroud's decision making watching that game is questionable. That decision making told me he's a great quarterback. But what that told me is that it was part of my concern preseason was you could be an average to above average quarterback and you'd get carried in the little games by how good this team is. And not saying Stroud is this, because outside of, this was probably one of his worst performances since he was rested. He looked like an average quarterback being carried by an amazing supporting cast. That's what he looked like. I mean, dramatically underthrowing I think maybe it was Smith and Jigba, but it was a deep route. Nebraska picks it off, quickly trying to make a play. I mean, he tried to make plays, and Nebraska, almost had more than 2 interceptions off of him. And maybe that's to say how good Nebraska's defense is. But there are some concerns at all offensive positions. I'd say even more than Stroud, it's the offensive line, because he was getting pressured a decent amount. And that definitely affected his decision making. And of course it will, because pressure always does that. And he's not used to it either. Ohio State's offensive line is one of the better O-lines in the country. They did not necessarily play like that against Nebraska. So those 2 games to me were the most interesting. They have the most impact. Nebraska, Purdue, the West Division teams, they have their own things they have to reflect on. Like Purdue is thinking like, this is legit. We could finish 8-4 and possibly finish the season ranked, and Jeff Brohm might actually be the guy. And Nebraska, it's similar yet not, because seeing your team's performance, it's in your mind you must be thinking, how is he not the guy? We are so close to beating all of these top 10 teams and we can't do it. And you're asking yourself, what is wrong? And for Ohio State and Michigan State, it's a reflection on we're good, but what can we improve? Ohio State, I don't know if you can exactly play like this at Michigan and win, because Michigan, unlike Nebraska, has been behind in games and has actually came back and won. Even same with Michigan State. Nebraska can't do that. They're a limited opponent. Michigan and Michigan State aren't nearly as limited as Nebraska. It's the same thing with Michigan State. If Michigan State gives up that many yards to a one-dimensional offense, think of Penn State. Penn State has Sean Clifford, Jahan Dotson, a pass block O-line, and nothing else on offense. They do not have a run game. Doesn't look like they need a run game to beat Michigan State. Ohio State, same thing, except they have a better O-line than Penn State does, and they have a running back that is close to being on Walker's par, except he's a freshman. And he's also proven to be elite when he's at the receiving end and catching the ball. So we'll see. It's a reflection for all 4 of these teams. I think all 4 of these teams next year, depending on what happens, can easily contend for their divisions. It's not like these teams are a Rutgers or Illinois where there has to be a lot of work done in a certain sense, at least in my opinion, or where there's a proven, where they've just never had success before in a certain sense. That's all I have to say for this video. It was a little different this time, but I enjoy focusing on just giving my thoughts on 2 or 3 key games and just talking about the rest of the team's performances in general in my power rankings. I enjoy it more. Let me know in the comments below if you enjoy that more as well. Thank you all for watching. Again, like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you around.